Okay, good. So, welcome. Before we start, by the way, we have two talks here. And so one talk is, that talk is about self-managing teams. And in case my talk start to get boring, you're perfectly fine, just walk there. Because it's somewhat similar. So also organizational stuff. And so this is more specifically within a LeSS context, what happens to the rest of the organization? And they are talking about the self-management in a general sense. Okay, so, feel free to ask questions. Please ask questions anytime you want. Okay, so that's, I really designed like that. In fact, actually one specific one that I would like you already to think about it and then drop in any time is the issues that you typically see if you have a LeSS adoption going on and then with the related to dealing with the rest of the organization. Okay, so a common one, the rest of the organization is, might be very command and control, and we are building self-management. Okay, so the more of those questions you have, the better it is. Okay, so then we can make it really useful. And so because I didn't make many slides, it's his fault, Frederick. So he got me to drinking and stuff, and it was just too much fun, etc. So, okay, good. So you can make it actually really short and very simple, the whole presentation, the whole idea. And if, how many of you have followed LeSS course? Ah, yeah, so you're very familiar with feature team adoption map, okay, and definition of done. And so basically you can say, well, what happens to the rest of the organization? Well, that's just a matter of expanding definition of done, right? And in the beginning of the journey, you typically define ideal definition of done, which is the X also axis in the feature team adoption map. So that means the further you go, the more it kind of like swallows the rest of the organization and problem solved. And so that's it, basically. Yeah, just keep expanding definition of done. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, not so simple, yeah. So I discovered, and that's basically what LeSS material says. And so if you want to know what it entails, how to do it, etc., you learn it in training, but you also can read a lot about it in the books. I found there is a lot of stuff missing. And so what I'm going to talk about is stuff that you're not going to read in the books. But it's actually what I gathered and experienced. That goes beyond or how all kinds of intricate difficulties about this. This is another example of that, and just to point out in this example, it says here, for example, market research. Okay, so this means that the whole marketing department goes away if at some point the teams are capable actually doing a market research also. And even regulatory requirements, so dealing with the regulator, talking to regulator, and figuring out what to do with those requirements, etc., could be also responsibility of the feature teams. There's nothing really special about it. It's just a matter of slowly getting there, and it happens. Yeah. And then it means that you don't need that department also. Okay? Yeah. You will share these slides later? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Don't need to. Yeah. Okay, so but many organizations, how many of you have a business lines in a company? Something called business lines, or something which is basically business lines. Okay. Few. Okay. For example, there's a different forms of business lines, two at least. One is basically there's a one department set up, and they're only doing in let's say corporate investment banking. They only do equity trading, let's say. Another one does fixed income. Another one does risk, not risk stuff. So there's that's one form. Another form. So this one is based on a kind of like a variation of the product. And another type is there is a marketing. There is a sales. There is a product development. There is etc. etc. These kind of departments. Okay. So there is a different manifestation of the business lines. Now. So what happens is there's if I maybe simplifying, there's all kinds of forms in between, but just for the sake of explaining this, so you could say I observed two kinds of less huge adoptions, and one is the small pockets okay, of less adoption. So how many of you have seen or heard or participated in a small pockets less adoption? So what I mean by that is within an organization you have a group of teams who start to share the backlog. And another group of teams start to share the backlog. How many of you? Yeah, it's really common, yeah. It's actually probably even more common than the right one. And then it becomes actually really maybe important for you to understand this usually doesn't succeed. Yeah. Okay, it hits a wall. And so it's interesting to understand why. And so each group, they bottom up typically. So they each group start to really realize all kinds of ways it's actually useful to share the same backlog and share code ownership, etc. Great. And so very enthusiastically start with that. But then immediately begs the question, who is actually the product owner? Right? So I could ask, like, do you have a proper product owner in that group? Yeah. It's a questionable. Yeah. And so we'll dive into that. I'm going to explain very deeply about the product owner position and more intricate aspects of that. So that's what the most visible trouble is then visible. So the product owner, then you can ask yourself, what is exactly that product owner doing? Even if it's a product owner for multiple teams. So it should have more power. And it kind of has, but in reality, not that much. And it has to do with those business lines that we have. Because typically those groups of teams are within one business line or something like that. Yeah. Like a corporate investment banking, to make a concrete example. I've been in quite a few corporate investment banks, and it seems they all organize a similar way, which means you have equity, fixed income, the prime brokerage and this kind of a business things. And then they have a bunch of IT teams which are serving them, and they're building stuff independently from each other, and so on and so on. Okay? So top down and bottom up. So you could have just to kind of clarify, you could in a top down and bottom up in a more as advised by less material and less training. Can also have a small pockets. Okay, so just to make it clear and for you to wonder, do I have an issue or not an issue? It could also have a small pocket, but the big difference is that in this case, the top management has decided to go in a certain direction. This means that everybody knows what will happen. In this case, they don't know and you didn't get the buy-in. You kind of hope that if you start making small pockets, that somehow they're going to converge together. The likelihood of that happening, not very high. Okay? And so in this case, you really from top down basically say, if we start to transform this group, whatever the product owner that we might have right now, that either is going to be really the product owner for over later on, who's going to be the product owner of everything, or you have a temporary product owner, which is going to be a product owner for that requirement area. Later is going to be requirement area, and then we're going to appoint a real one as soon as we have I don't know, 2 years or 3 years, etc. That kind of decision making. And that product owner has a real power then. It's a more proper product owner. Okay. So it's a huge difference in between. Now, let's look at this is to give you a bit of a context before we kind of explore all kinds of issues and things how to resolve. And so in one of the companies, they asked me, can you teach us how does a product organization typically get organized, regardless of LeSS, but just simply product organization. What kind of product organization do we have? So I'm going to explain you what I explained to them, and interesting dilemmas there. So one is, thing is that this is also a product organization, by the way. So there's a division or a business unit or a general management model. Okay, so what are the characteristics? So typically you have a head of business units. So the business units are really important in this case. It's still a product organization. And then you have a chief technology officer. And so it's heading a certain kind of like a people and to set up the infrastructure, research and development, etc. And so how does work basically flows is predominantly from the head of business units, which are providing requirements. Yeah. So and, they have their own objectives, each of these heads, and those objectives then go to the product owner. And the product owner needs to then juggle between those requirements and objectives. Now, I don't know if you see the trouble here. The trouble is, if the CEO discusses in a board what should be done and what the objective of each business unit is, even if that's properly aligned on this level, as soon as you leave the room, those things start to live on their own. This means when it comes to product owner, you immediately end up with a problem that conflicting objectives. And so the product owner may, or even if you have a really kind of like a high level product owner, needs to then juggle between those and see which ones are more important or not. Okay? So this positions the product owner, this from actual observation and coaching those product owners, this positioning product owner in just a very tense political energy spending. Yeah. So the constant struggle for the product owner is not how do I prioritize my backlog, but how do I deal with them? Because one says this and they claims it's actually aligned with the CEO, another one says that, and in the meantime things changing, we actually see what the customer actually does, and how do you mix this? Yeah. And so in such case, if the product owner says, you know what, I'm going to overrule them, well, good luck with that. It just escalates and becomes a bit of a mess politically. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but there is a certain advantage, disadvantage that I explained. So to them, these advantages, each of them can locally prioritize things very easily. Yeah. This is a typical argument why companies are not so keen to have a single backlog. This is probably the biggest argument, the biggest issues the organizations have. Because they cannot, each of them wants to have a freedom to prioritize locally. Okay? And why? I don't know, even if you are married, you sometimes think, I just want to do something without constantly talking to you about it. Yeah. With a single backlog, you have to. You basically, when you introduce a single backlog in a company with a separate units and business units, etc., you basically are introducing a forced marriage. Okay? Because you have to talk to each other. It's not comfortable. Actually not comfortable for everybody involved, even CEO. Because all these debates and stuff, they quite often just go to CEO, say, you need to make a decision now, okay? Because we cannot get it. And it gets really tiring. Yeah. They never really learn to actually work as a team. So one of the consequences of, just let me finish the sentence. So one of the consequences of having real less adoption, really successful one, is that a management team starts to realize they've never been actually a team, and they have to be. This is just a must for a successful less adoption. If that doesn't happen, what happens, they will very likely start to go in the direction of splitting the backlog up. Okay, Alexei?
Just to clarify, so where would the backlog be on this picture? You're saying the backlog is at the chief engineer and CEO level, and that would be a conflict of that management.
So in this case, this structure, let's say this is an existing structure, we introduce less. Yeah, we introduce less, and in that existing structure, so we introduce a product owner, but it's still existing structure, and then the product owner is supposed to be prioritizing. But, and so you end up in this conflict and this trouble that happens. So in this case, the product owner is not, if you introduce properly less, product owner is basically not connected to any of these. It's a separate somebody who's actually reporting then to CEO even. Sorry? Like InfoSec? Yeah, yes. So it's a separate individual which might be positioned reporting to even CEO level, but it doesn't really help much. Yes, so that's what typically happens. The backlogs are basically on the business unit level, and also CTO typically also has a backlog, like I don't know, infrastructure replacement, all this stuff. So they all have backlogs. So saying we should have a single backlog, you can imagine how difficult that is. Logically, it's trivial. In reality, not, because of this structure. Okay. Oh, you could define product really well. In this case, let's say in this case is internet banking, very modern. So it's financial services to the normal people, and so yeah, startup, and it's a perfectly fine single backlog, a single product, no problem. Yeah, so what happens with the business unit, when you say we have a single backlog, it becomes very confusing for them because they don't see a single backlog, a single product, sorry, because single product means single backlog. And so this all becomes very confusing, so they push back and they say, I really see this is a separate product, and they keep arguing, this is a separate product. It's not separate product, but for them it makes sense because of the structure that it is.
About that management team should become a team, right?
Yeah.
What I see a lot is that the people, it's not really in their interest to become a team since they have their separate KPIs and targets. So that's why they're hiding their product from the portfolio backlog, if you call it like that.
Yeah.
You recognize that practice?
Yes, absolutely. That was one of the things I want to talk about a bit later, but I can address actually right now, is that what happens indeed is that a common practice to give some KPIs, nowadays they all call OKRs. And it's funny enough how it doesn't look different from KPIs because everybody misunderstands KPIs, so they, OKRs. And so, because the OKRs have nothing to do with this. You cannot give OKRs to separate business units. They cannot, it's not possible, but they still do it. And yes, this reinforces this problem. And so they literally use that as a main reason when they debate with the product owner. So product owner, I want this to be prioritized. And product owner says, no. Yeah, but we talk about the strategic things, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, things change in the meantime. Yeah, but I have my OKR. How can I ever achieve it? Because I heavily depend on a product development to actually achieve my OKR. Marketing, typically. And so marketing needs to achieve something, but they really require something in the product to be happening. And so yes, and then they go back to CEO, complain to CEO. In this case, specific case, CEO really respects the fact that we do less single product and everything. And so he goes to, they go to CEO and complain there, and they say, yeah, product owner doesn't want to prioritize my stuff. Okay, so we can talk about it with the product owner. Product owner explains, this is the reason I don't do it. Okay, that makes sense. CEO says, sorry, not gonna do this. And then they say, what's the point of having an OKR then? Good point. So those OKRs become useless. This is one experience. Yeah, it doesn't go like that. It becomes much worse. Meaning that the product owner really is not prioritizing anymore. They're just simply juggling between different stakes if those OKRs really become meaningful. Yeah. Underlying issue, which is for me much more important than teaching them and showing them, is not necessarily, is not only this issue of splitting up things between business units, is actually the timeline. Because the OKRs and objectives, or whatever you want to call them, they are over a longer period of time. And so they are typically set for 1 year or something. And then we introduce LeSS with the proper product backlog, which means it changes literally on almost daily basis. And that's where the biggest trouble comes from, immediately almost. As soon as you set the OKRs, literally within a days, product owner talks to some people and they found out, oh, we should reprioritize this. There you go with your OKRs. Even if the product backlog is originally based on the OKRs that they had. You're supposed to then change the OKRs. Nobody does it. Yeah.
One interesting characteristic of the setup is there's a lot of high-paid efficient path, which is like optimization, conversion, you have conversion of very control.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's correct. That's indeed the thing. The interesting consequence, if you really introduce LESS, I'm talking about really now prefer to talk about in a successful LESS adoption. The interesting consequence is that in that case, the power then can or shifts towards the product owner, but the product owner is not really perceived as more positioned as the business heads. So, so the board meetings, I participated in the board meetings, they become astonishingly useless. And so everybody's just projecting their thing that should be happening, and everybody just telling, this should happen, I think we should do that. And they start to debate whether that's the case or not. It becomes really messy. There's no much data happening, just opinions. And because of they are highly positioned and they consider themselves like they know stuff, and so they push their agenda. And everybody's just pushing the agenda, and the meeting is really useless then. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll come to that. So actually, if you're in that position, that happens. This is actually from if you look at all LESS adoption, this is a bit of a luxury position, if you ask me. If you end up the board actually being in a bit of a mess, it's a good sign, because now it's the next step. What do you do then? Yeah. So there is another type of organization, functional model. Okay, so the functional model, you have a CEO, and then basically chief technology officer, chief product officer. This is a typical, what a typical called product organization, like Apple style, etc. And so then you have heads of engineering there, head of product management, and so on and so on. So what's important is characteristics, product and engineering are centralized and on equal level. Okay, product team drives marketing, pricing, UX. Product supports units instead of our business units. Okay, so ability to prioritize a resource, a holistic view of the whole thing. Okay, holistic view of engineering, easy alignment between product engineering because they see the whole scope. So, and this so this sounds like a typical LESS, right? So LESS fits perfectly in a type of organizations like Apple and so on. So because there's a holistic view on what you're actually doing. Sounds great, right? Well, there's disadvantages, and it's not really LESS that we're talking about. I'll dive in what actually happens. So, so reprioritization is actually really complicated. Because it needs to be constantly central. Anybody who wants to do something differently, imagine that you're large with lots of teams, lots of people. If this decision making always need to be central, it just becomes a big problem. Yeah. Execution is perceived as slow due to complexity of engineering. So you constantly actually talk about really on a top level. So now engineering needs to do this. Yeah, how do we organize that? Yeah. How do we do that? That's a big question. Okay, so so instead, what I advised in one of the companies, and what happens also in one of the companies based on advice, is, and that's also we need to understand how LESS works in this kind of situation. So it is the central prioritization, but on a practical level, prioritization actually happens distributed. It doesn't. It seems to contradict each other. But it doesn't, because for the stakeholders, the details matter a lot, okay? So if you have a really less huge with lots of teams, the product owner will actually prioritize strategically. And the stakeholders typically, when they agree strategically, then they go on a detail level, and then they want to work more closely with the teams and directly influence the prioritization. Yeah? Yeah, in that case, the OKRs start to make sense. Yes, because the OKRs are not anymore per business unit, which doesn't make them OKRs even anymore. So I just call them measurables, by the way. I don't find much use in a fancy terminology, but it's the same thing. Nothing wrong with the OKRs. It's just got really spoiled, the term. Yeah, but clearly measurables become really, really important, and that's how it's communicated. Yeah. Sorry?
Who is running operations, business operations?
So it's a support function. It's one of the support functions because the prioritization for operations is under the product head. Because, so if, for example, this is actually really important. One of the missing things often when it comes to operations is a huge source of information and a potential to optimize your product, to make the product better. So therefore, what happens there and the information that comes out of there and how they should be structured should be part of the prioritization of the product.
So in this graph, why is not operations included?
Oh, that's just simply how it's being run by prioritization. Yeah, okay, that's a bit of a, then, sorry, yeah, it should be also, there is a line here. Okay, sorry, yeah, there's a line here, yeah.
So last question, if you have multiple markets, let's say 5 countries in Europe, then each of them is will be something called a country manager.
Yeah.
Who is responsible for that country, that operations. How does that fit into equation?
It does because it just means that operations might be split per country here, but all those operations are also the way they work and how it's set up, etc., is driven still by the head of product.
So country manager would report, for example.
Yes, yeah. When it comes to prioritizing the work, reporting is a bit tricky word because usually when we say reporting is a managerial reporting, that's not the case because product owner is not a manager. Typical manager, it's not a line manager. But it does decide and state that the way we're going to do operations is this way. I'm going to set a vision for that. Yeah? Yeah?
I've seen this type of structure.
Mm.
Usually there's an imbalance between the level of power between the head of products and the head of engineering.
Yeah.
And usually the balance is towards the head of product.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recognize this and how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So I've noticed when the head of there is an imbalance in the scope that they're actually covering. And so in a LeSS, head of engineering is actually manager of all teams and everybody there. In the cases that I see the problem, that imbalance that you mentioned, the head of engineering is not actually manager of everybody in the teams, all areas, etc. I don't know if different in your case.
Usually what we produce
Yeah.
is from the guy who's in charge of the teams.
Yeah.
More people because we have a very important product.
Yes. Okay, so that we, in advanced LeSS adoptions, maybe that has to do with just simply how LeSS is really implemented, is that I made very clear in a board, and we made agreement that the product owner has no saying over how teams work in any way. And also how many people should we hire is not his decision. Obviously, they collaborate, but just for sake of a conflict, the head of engineering is the one deciding that. Yeah, and not product. So product owner can say, I want more teams. Sorry, not your problem. Tell me the priority. Yeah, sorry, it was first, yeah. Yeah. Yes, correct. That's correct. So the engineering cannot actually decide what to prioritize. So obviously, head of engineering is going to say about standards and we should do quality and blah, 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 and then talk to head of product, but the head of product can overrule that. Yeah. You had a question, right? Oh, no. Okay.
Is the head of product responsible for P&L?
For P&L?
Profit and loss of
No. No, he's obviously reasoning and also prioritizing clearly based on return on investment. So he really prioritized. That's one of the biggest factor for him. And but he doesn't have a responsible P&L for a simple reason, because there is a lot more involved in a P&L question than only prioritization of the product. Yeah. That's the CEO. In typically less adoptions, well-advanced less adoption, responsible for the P&L is the CEO. And product owner cannot prioritize something if it's not in aligned with the strategic decision of a CEO.
Just imagine the situation when you have 15 companies, 15 country managers, 15 owners of P&L,
Yeah.
one head of product, with the product organization. And
Okay.
these country managers are fighting with product owners. They own P&L.
Yeah.
Product owners are just
Okay.
employees at the door.
Okay. I now understand. That's actually exactly the problem of basically similar to business lines. There's basically exactly the problem that I also observe. The business lines have this power and they do it. How to solve in that situation, I'm not sure, because let me use a very different example which I had in my head. An international second biggest bank in the world. I do less adoption there, etc. Also the fifth one, and so they basically they're huge all over the world. And so there's two of those compared to each other. One is highly centralized, and another one was highly decentralized. And this means that the highly centralized one is basically the single prioritization thing, just not less style, but also still single prioritization. And they build stuff there, and the countries simply have to use whatever is being done. And obviously they can actually suggest and ask for to something to be built, but the central organ can ignore. Now, consequence of that, because of the size, is that things go slow. And so the countries are getting very uncomfortable. Now, you could say, why don't you just decentralize, and every country decides for themselves actually how they're going to do it. You immediately end up with duplication and a disconnection, etc. I don't have a solution. It's some kind of a balance. LeSS does help in that. Why? Because it's a directly collaborative setup, meaning that you have a decentralization with a minimal effects of disconnect between teams, because teams directly collaborate with each other. So it makes the problem less present because the collaboration, level of collaboration. Okay? Good. Now, product owner position. Let me see. So, how does it look like? So this is a typical LeSS explanation of product owner position. Okay? So I'm not going to talk about it. So there is one thing which is actually not mentioned there, and the book also doesn't really, if I recall, books don't really talk about it much. It's does the product owner manage stakeholders? So in Scrum, I think it says, no? Oh, okay, my mistake, okay. So the stakeholder is an interesting thing. So there is an official term of what a stakeholder is, which is pretty good, except that nobody is actually knowing what it is. Nobody is really using it as it's supposed to be. What I usually observe when they say the word stakeholder, it means somebody who has a real power. It doesn't say, hey, I have a stake in this, I would like to have this, please decide yourself as a product owner whether it's actually important to you or not. No, they come, I want this, when are you going to deliver it? And they chase, and then you have a whole bunch of stakeholders, and what typically happens is that's one stakeholder knows there's a bunch of others who are going to also talk to the product owner. I'm going to use you as a product owner. So they know that, so they compete. Without explicitly saying that. So the reason why they put such a pressure on a product owner is because they know if they don't put the pressure, somebody else will. My stuff is not going to be done. Yeah. And so they ask, when is my stuff going to be done? Okay. So this has nothing to do with the stakeholders, but this is unfortunately the most common definition of a stakeholder I observe. Yeah. Okay, so if the product owner, very simple test, if your product owner is managing stakeholders, you have a problem. Because product owner shouldn't need to manage stakeholders. Yeah. Why? They don't care. Stakeholder is just a stakeholder. Let's say you are concerned about security. You come to me, as a security expert, I advise you to do this and that. Oh, thank you, says product owner. It's very valuable. Because there's something, as a product owner, I cannot know everything. That's not possible. So therefore, I have a people, like a security officer, who comes to me and says, hey, have you considered that and that? Oh, wow, thank you so much. Can you help me actually what it means and participate refinement, suggest what should that be? It's actually really valuable. But that's not what the product owner says. Yeah, it's usually very different. It's pain. Yeah. So this also typically, we say in a less material, the product owner is basically somebody on a product management, business unit, marketing. The reality is much more complicated. Because if you have a whole bunch of business units, and product owner is in a business unit, one of them, maybe not a good idea. Yeah. Because it's going to be stuck there, your less adoption. You cannot expand further. So another picture is like this one. This one is, by the way, typical when you product development organizations. So you have a customers outside. And so having a product owner in marketing, also probably not a good idea. It's just a too narrow perspective on a product. Yeah. But it's very common. Yeah, it does happen. And so I suggest to really consider what I just before explained and position product owner with a view of these issues that I just mentioned. Otherwise, you're going to be too constrained. Yeah. Now, this is typically like a banking, etc., internal product development, where you have outside customers, but the product development is for the users internally. So same in this case, you have a business unit, and so who should be? Well, it should be somebody who's actually at least really high up in those business units. Yeah. And also consideration may be actually even higher than that, who's actually cross-cutting those business units, if it's a bank, for example. In this case, I'll skip this. When you outsource stuff, not much different. So I just briefly mentioned company strategy and product vision. There's also an interesting problem let's dive into. So one problem that happens and also then gets resolved with a better positioning of the product owner is the broken feedback loop between strategy and product prioritization. So if you have a really well-going product backlog and product vision, etc., it means the product owner is constantly reprioritizing things, is constantly seeking, based on the feedback, is changing priorities. The backlog is not long. But then you have a strategy and people outside the organization, which are more not really into this kind of an iterative, incremental way of working. They are thinking in a very much longer term. They say, we agreed last year in January to do this. When is going to be delivered? And so it's fascinating. The longer it goes, the bigger the gap becomes, until it becomes really ridiculous, meaning that these questions start to really sound ridiculous from stakeholders. We agreed something in January, why is not delivered yet? What was it again? I don't even remember, says product owner. Nobody cares. How come? But we talked about it and when it happened. You said that you're going to put in a backlog. Oh yeah, I did. But I removed it again. So this disconnect is then really a problem. So you could say, yeah, but then in that case, you just simply need to align accordingly. So meaning that you also, on a board member, need to revisit this all the time. Now, the challenge and requirement that happens, should happen, is that the board typically doesn't have experience and knowledge of how to actually make decisions based on a continuous feedback. It's not so common, and so that's also required. And but this requires also a certain level of humility, because the higher you are, the more is a bit of a picture of we know what we are talking about, and so it requires also showing them by evidence that the past decisions didn't work out by we know what we are talking about. And so they need to be much more humble that they actually don't really know what they're talking about, and you need to use the feedback to actually make your decisions, and data. Now, I mentioned this one already. Strategic direction yearly, and product backlog priorities change almost daily. Yeah. So, and this affects the other one enormously. And this is a consequence that I saw a lot. Yeah. So, a very different one, collaborative, non-collaborative teams. Once you're in a really advanced LeSS adoption, and people and the teams are really used to it, a collaborative way of working, meaning that if you need to get something done, you just go to other team and talk to them and get it done. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Now, let me tell you a story. This is a Port of Rotterdam in Netherlands. What happened is that in Port of Rotterdam, there is basically tracking ships in the harbor, and there is a certain messaging happens between a hub of messaging and terminals and all kinds of parties in the harbor, and that system which actually tracks everything that happens in the harbor. There's lots of messaging happening back and forth. It's considered something really important part of developing of the product. So we organized a meeting, and the teams, self-managed fully, they came to a meeting. Not all teams, a representative of teams, a bunch of people, who are going to talk about how do we do this messaging. And so they came there, and the other side sent a heavy lifting program manager with a tie and everything, and developers literally came in shorts. And then we sit there, and they came with 2 or 3 of them with a really, and then they start to explain, okay, we should in this meeting talk about how do we do governance of the project that's going to actually implement. They're going to talk about the governance of the project to set up to implement the messages. And so developers are like, what are you talking about? They couldn't understand what they're even talking about. And at some point, after finishing that explanation, I was there. It was really funny to watch. I was almost laughing at the spot. So the developer said, do you have an XML definition? And the guy didn't understand what the heck they're talking about. And we stopped the meeting and said, maybe next time you send a team. Yeah. And developers, and we talk about XML messages. Yeah. Don't make it complicated, despite it's really important. So that's what happened. Now, the funny thing, interesting about that story, is in this case that I talked about, we as a group could decide to change the setting of this kind of a collaboration to be more collaborative. Okay? So more directly collaborative, not contractual and all this kind of stuff. And, but very often that's not the case. Right? So you come as a team and you want to have really collaborate with each other, and the other party says, no, we need to write down beforehand and the contract and all this kind of stuff. That's basically one of the issues, typical issues when you, 10 minutes, okay. And so there's a mismatch between product development and other teams. So, another funny mismatch is that in the manifestation is encountering this, is that you have a self-managed teams, and it sits with the actual people in the other team, okay, so that they sit together, and then the self-managed team, hey, shall we do this? Shall we have an XML message, let's take that example, like this and that. And then this other group really doesn't respond much, non-self-managed team members. And why? Because they immediately say, we need to talk to a manager. So they just cannot decide. The self-managed team gets frustrated. We cannot get anything done because we're supposed to just decide at a spot. And no, we need to check. There's constantly always checking. So there's a meeting before the meeting and after the meeting and a meeting and a meeting. So you ends up with lots of meetings just because manager is basically one deciding. Yeah. Another issue. So when you end up with this kind of a situation, it's sometimes useful to have a matchmakers. Okay, so matchmaker is a preferred alternative, temporary solution. So meaning somebody who's actually kind of like facilitating them collaborating in a more productive way in order to resolve that. And but obviously consequence for other teams will be that they have to become self-managed also. So LeSS adoption creates a necessity for the rest of the organization to become also self-managed because the combination doesn't work really well. Especially if you have high dependency in between. So another solution, and this is a bit less preferred, is a point of contacts. Because quite often the rest of the organization wants to have a single point of contact. You could do that, but a temporary solution. And the point of contact should be a team member, okay, not a project manager.
Who should be a matchmaker?
It can be, typically Scrum Masters happen, but it doesn't need to be necessarily Scrum Master. Yeah. Yeah. So therefore, what happens is that the business lines get dissolved as a consequence of less adoption, because of what I just mentioned. It's just inevitable in order to progress further. And so this is heavy lifting. This means really, with a board, very sensitive, very impactful, because you're literally removing people off the position on the highest level. So you can imagine the impact of that. But it does happen. We have one case where this actually happened. Yeah. I'm going to mention the name because I think I explained a lot what happens there. Yeah. So this means that people from those units move to requirements areas, and, such as marketing, etc. Do they go into the teams directly? Maybe not yet. But at least they are closer, and they're being driven more directly by the priorities of the requirements area. So when it comes to work, they kind of a report, as you might say, to the product owner from their perspective. Yeah. Area product owner, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So they stay in the requirements area, but they kind of like, if there are a few marketing people, they have a kind of like a smallish team there, and they're supporting that requirements area. But they are basically, the work is decided by the priority of the area product owner.
So they take work from the backlog?
Yeah. Or they, yes.
And they are a small marketing team?
Yeah. That's correct, yeah. In the practicality of it, whether it's a single backlog or a separate backlog, in reality it's going to be separate anyway, because it's a kind of a special type of items anyway. So, yeah. And so they're treated differently anyway. Yeah. Okay, so that's a solution. It's a temporary solution, as you can imagine. You want to actually start exploring that and going in a certain direction of incorporating that into the teams. So that's an in-between step to incorporate marketing into the teams. Yeah. Now, stakeholders mentioned already, no stakeholders. Okay, so as not an official term, that's perfectly fine. It's just unofficial common term. There is no need to manage stakeholders. As soon as somebody says, I need to manage stakeholders, you have an issue. That's a good sign to actually pay attention to what the heck is going on. That's it. Questions? More questions? Remarks? Ooh, that differs per company a lot. So in one bank in the Netherlands, for example, that process took a very long. That's actually experience of where we started to hit the wall, essentially. And so in that case, it took a long time. We even actually shifted the units, people, and in the last part we did. But they still couldn't resolve. They start to see requirements areas as business lines. So it took quite a many years. So that was so partially successful, and because of the pockets thing. That's why I'm talking about the pockets problem. And another one in a bank also, a startup bank, and so they did it really fast because startup. And there was a clear necessity, which in about 2 years, we basically, from the 3 years, from the start of adoption until we resolve the business lines, 3 years. Yeah. So it's pretty fast, really fast actually.
If the stakeholders are the ones who are actually funding the product development or some initiatives,
Are they rich?
Well, they are in the position in the company when they can fund.
Oh, you mean budgeting shit? Yeah. Yeah, budgeting.
Decision makers over there, so in that
Yeah.
funding.
Yeah.
They're not shareholders who actually.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the underlying assumption, which I didn't mention in LeSS, is that you kill the budgeting game from the start. You cannot have that. It doesn't work with LeSS at all. Yeah. So it cannot be that somebody.
But still they are deciding.
Sure, but the decision-making power is based on a budget thing.
Not necessarily.
Why?
An incentive with no budget have the power to decide whether some initiative will be approved or not.
Yeah, but the question is where the power comes from.
Well, the company has a management, right? Everyone has.
Yes, but the company says we want to do less and want a single prioritization. And I have a product owner who decides that.
Right. Let me rephrase the question.
Yeah.
It is decided,
Yeah?
and somebody has decided.
Yes.
You cannot manage stakeholders as we put there.
Yeah.
How do you interact with them? How do you call them?
You have a problem, big problem in that case. Because it's going to hit the wall, or what I mentioned in the beginning, the first slide. You basically you're hitting a hard wall. There is no way through it, given the conditions that you explained. So it means that you are at the mercy of those stakeholders forever.
Right. So what did you mean by manage stakeholders?
What I mean is that you say it's been decided, we undecided. That's what I mean. It's been decided that they have a power, we undecide that. That's what I mean. And only then you can break the wall. Yeah.
I tried to change the terminology here.
Yes.
Not managing stakeholders, but involving stakeholders.
Yeah.
Because then it feels like you're on the same side. If you say manage, the person who's managed, then you're deciding for someone else. So it's about framing as well.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. But then you talk about the real stakeholder thing, which is no problem whatsoever with that. I totally agree with that. I was making a distinction between two explicitly because to realize there is a really massive difference between a real stakeholder, no problem at all, and so-called stakeholders, which are just power players. Yeah. No, because the real stakeholders don't have power over priority at all. They just have a stake into our overall picture. Yes.
That's what I mean. But the thing is, if you, I've been a project manager for a long time before I went
Yeah.
in consultant. And how the power play in the company is always a problem.
Yes.
But usually, if you up the communication by involving people,
Yeah.
it levels the playing field better. That's what I mean with involving.
Yeah. Sure, but when involvement comes to play, and then in that involvement, one stakeholder says, "I think we should go in this direction," another one says, "I think we should go in that direction." What do you do in that case? That tends to waste time a lot. Okay. Yeah. That's from my experience, because it becomes like a big discussion. That's the story that I mentioned about the board members discussing with each other endlessly. Yeah. And by the way, if you have 5 stakeholders having their own views with disagreement, and they talk to each other and they come to agreement, is that a good agreement? Why the heck are we listening to stakeholders for the product? We should listen to the customer. That's another problem that I noticed. So they completely forget about the customer because they're so occupied, they're agreeing with each other. Yeah. That's what I also observe. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned budgeting P word, and what do you mean by that?
Because in the LeSS actually doesn't, it just doesn't work at all if you have a budgeting splintered, meaning that somebody kind of a device budget and they have a decision-making power because they have the budget. So they basically say, I want this to happen because I have a budget to spend. That doesn't work with LeSS at all because it immediately kills the single prioritization thing. So if you have a single backlog thing and prioritize, product owner is just going to decide whether you have a budget or not budget. And so somebody says, yeah, but I've been given a budget to use and I cannot use my budget. Yeah. You see, it kills the game completely. It just doesn't match at all, like not even a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
On the very first slide, we talked about the proposal bottom up, top down, bottom up.
Yeah.
When I first learned about this, I was like, yeah, top down, bottom up, whatever. And when I worked on a number where they were more bottom up. And then I've now been in 2 situations where we have top down and bottom up. However, I think we don't talk enough about that big middle.
Yeah.
And they can do a lot, and it really depends on company culture, their structures. But like I work with a lot of really old companies, and not even the C-level, to the best of their cases, can maybe reorganize, and then there is a force.
Yeah.
This married with organizational design issues, married with how you define products, business lines, all of these things together.
Yes.
I mean, these are very real challenges that we face.
Yes. Absolutely valid.
I've had that middle heal so much as a force.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let me react to this, the last one, because we probably need to go. So absolutely valid, and I have indeed same experience, especially if the number of layers is higher, then it becomes harder and harder to deal with that. Because the dynamic in between is like a big force, as you explained exactly. So I had some experience that force is basically pushing enormously back and contradicting, and it just kills the adoption also. And but also in other cases, because of experience of learning that, how destructive that can be. So when I deal with it, when I say top down, I don't mean only top, I mean top going down, and I spend huge amount of effort and many workshops with the top to actually involve the down levels. And in actual down levels, that basically I let them be part of the change. And they, even in some cases, if we're really successful, they have to become drivers of the change. Yeah. Okay, thank you.